O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Minister Statement. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, as part of this government's mandate to diversify the economy to provide greater opportunity for our residents, we are moving forward with our vision to revitalize the Great Slave Lake fishery. Since the release of our revitalization strategy last year, we've been working to put into place the many elements needed to move our vision forward. We have researched and are confident that the market exists for a unique freshwater fish that Great Slave Lake can supply. We have identified with the Tutro Cooperative a variable business plan that will enable current and future N.W.T fishers to regain their livelihood and benefit from a direct say in the revitalized commercial fishing sector. More importantly, we have met and talked with fishers from both north and south of Great Slave Lake who have expressed approval and support for our plans. As we prepare to take our next steps, Mr. Speaker, there are 5 components that will be essential to revitalizing our vision. That includes a new fish processing plant in Hay River, run by the Fishers Cooperative, which can continue to sell to Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation and its successor, as well to direct to market. Collection stations in Yellowknife and Fort Resolution to enable fishers to access quota in other parts of Great Slave Lake, balance harvest and increase production. New fishers to maintain quota and supply and ensure the continued viability of the sector for the future. A marketing strategy that will be developed in new northern brand, identified target markets and expanded sales, and new products such as raw, fresh and frozen fillets and fertilizer. That will boost the N.W.T production, make it more competitive and marketable, and add to its economic value and support local jobs and opportunities. If anything, Mr. Speaker, our work to date has shown the importance of being flexible and fully responsive to the opportunities and circumstances as they present themselves. To that end, we are moving quickly in light of the federal government's up-and-coming year-end to leverage partnership dollars that will allow us to finance the processing plant that is so pivotal in our revitalization plan. Cost for the plant will depend in part in the equipment options. Should all funding be secure, we are prepared to invest as much as $12 million into this critical piece of infrastructure. We see the signing of the integrated bilateral agreement with Infrastructure Canada as a positive step that opens the door for us to advance our work on the Hay River Fishing Processing Plant under the Investing in Canada plan. In the meantime, we are already working with the Department of Infrastructure on site selection, equipment purchasing, and a tender for a building design. Mr. Speaker, rebuilding a commercial fishery won't happen overnight. There's still much work to be done. Even as we pursue funding options with the Government of Canada, the Government of Northwest Territories was first to sign on the new 6-year Canada Fish and Seafood Program Framework Agreement. Our participation in this framework will support the marketing requirements of our strategy and allow us to capitalize on growth opportunities in the Northwest Territories as we transition to a more streamlined and collaborative fish and seafood sector in Canada. The challenge before us, Mr. Speaker, is to connect and pull all these pieces in place in the next couple of months so that construction can begin in the summer of 2019 and a new fish plant will be ready to go in Hay River for the 2020 fishing season. I look forward to updating members of this Legislative Assembly on the progress of this exciting investment that will result in the revitalized and sustainable sector, a renewed livelihood for fishers, great community wellness, local food production, and added value to the Northwest Territories economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Statement. Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I can feel it. I can feel it in the air. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to provide members with information on the 2018 Arctic Winter Games, which are being hosted from March 18th to March 24th in the South Slave region. The Northwest Territories has been an active participant in the Arctic Winter Games since its inception in 1970. These games are an important celebration of sport and culture for youth from the circumpolar region. We are proud to host the 2018 Games, and we are even more proud of Team N.T., who will be representing the Northwest Territories. Team N.T. will consist of approximately 350 athletes, coaches, cultural performers, and mission staff. Territorial trials were held in December and January in the communities of Inuvik, Hay River, Fort Smith, and Yellowknife. I'd like to congratulate all the participants who tried out for Team N.T. These athletes should be applauded for their commitment to their sport, their communities, and to active living. Team N.T. will join athletes and cultural performers from Alaska, Yukon, Northern Alberta, Nunavut, Greenland, Nunavik, the Russian province of Yamal, and the Northern European region of Sapmi. The Arctic Winter Games plays an important role in the development of our athletes. Our youth look forward to the Games every 2 years for the opportunity to share in competition and cultural exchanges. I am confident that our youth will once again benefit from this experience. Friendships will be formed, and our young people will return with many lasting memories. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Sport North Federation, the territorial sport organizations, regional coordinators, and the many hardworking volunteers who are leaders in our sports system. Without their hard work and the thousands of hours that they give, the Arctic Winter Games and many other sporting events would not take place. I am pleased to confirm that we will also be sponsoring 20 youth ambassadors, ranging in age from 16 to 24, who will be assigned volunteer roles in both Hay River and Fort Smith. These young people come from 14 different communities, and they've been preparing since November to represent our territory as part of the host society welcoming the circumpolar world to the South Slave. Our youth ambassadors will have a variety of roles, including athlete care and comfort, food services, medal ceremonies, and providing support to sport venues. I understand they may also have a special role in the opening ceremonies. Mr. Speaker, every year since 2007, our Youth Ambassador Program has offered an opportunity for Northwest Territories youth to volunteer at major events such as the Arctic Winter Games. These opportunities help build self-confidence and develop skills, and they provide a way for our youth to learn more about our people and cultures. I am extremely proud of the Northwest Territories Youth Ambassador Program and all the participants who have humbly served at major events. They are our future leaders. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the South Slave 2018 Arctic Winter Games Host Society, the volunteers in the South Slave region, and to those who will be traveling from within the Northwest Territories to volunteer. Without these volunteers, the Games would not be possible, and it is important to recognize the tremendous work they have done and they will continue doing during the Games and after. In closing, on behalf of the government of the Northwest Territories, I would like to wish Team N.T. the best of luck at the 2018 Arctic Winter Games. I'd also like to reaffirm to them and to all of our young Northern athletes and volunteers how proud we are of their accomplishments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to all the volunteers who are making the Games a reality, and good luck to all the athletes. Minister statements. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Minister of Health and Social Services will be late arriving in the House today due to a personal matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member Decho. Oh, Decho.
Mr. Speaker, today I want to speak about my biological mother, the late Monique Sabrin of Fort Providence, in honor of International Women's Day. Monique Sabrin Ni Lafoin was an elder featured in the book Nahe Cho Ke, which was written in the 1980s. Here is her words of experiences. Sot e go he ni zun windi. Haegare ni ba nila na dichimiji thon mai da mela gotlicha meke gotle na gutsa kashu meke gotle atsi ihena gonde gutsa na he gonde ka sitsau din di sitsau din di kin thlago shak ile sitsau din thile sut in kinizun na he ragati hi thlago asi thlego na he tsen le kena dile kin go chani dan na thi de ka asi na he wonkiu di wa kin thlago shak ile sita thani na he ganaze Detsen asi ushijet a gutsindi. Se deneshu naheja dishin ta kunidijon. On kenezon denekyo di kwen gugwinli. Kane zun guwa nathi tit a sao nana kala gugindi. Dutsene la kala kadi egalainta sea nizun. Tu kotle etha etsin mi egalatsenta. Mr. Speaker, my mother had TB and I was born at the Charles Camsell Hospital in Edmonton. I was adopted to another family as a child. I was blessed to have had the experience of having two sets of parents in my life. I want to thank my biological mother, the late Monique Sabrin, for making an enriching family life. She passed away in April 2002. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Member statements. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to acknowledge an impressive young person of the Nahende region, Jonah Sanguis, a resident of Jean Marie, who is in her second year of trapping. She was taught by her mother and continues striving to learn more about her family's background in living off the land. Jonah is one of the 5 young trappers the N.W.T awarded a Trappers Recognition Award from the territorial government. The N.W.T Trappers Recognition Award recognizes the hard work N.W.T trappers put into their craft and the contribution they make in the genuine Mackenzie Valley Fur Program. Jonah values being out in the land and learns plenty from her mother, such as hunting, trapping, and survival skills. According to Jonah, inspiration came from her mother's family trapping for many years and her brothers teaching her while growing up. They were always encouraging her to further her knowledge. Jonah's proudest moment was when she received the N.W.T Trappers Recognition Award this year for all her hard work. The recognition for something that has been passed down for generations in Jonah's family is being an honor for both Jonah and family. Although trapping runs in the family, Jonah has faced several obstacles such as the cold winter temperatures, breaking trail where there wasn't one, and checking traps set 1 kilometer or more away from the camp. The past 2 years have been memorable for Jonah. After regular participation in traditional teachings and being awarded for her contribution, Jonah looks forward to many successful years to come. I'd like to thank the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources for recognizing trappers across the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, we're very fortunate to have young individuals advocating these principles in our communities. On behalf of the region, Ms. Cho, and congratulations to Jonah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member statement. Member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to reflect on the debate we had a year ago about the introduction of junior kindergarten. Much of the discussion at that time concerned funding, but I also talked about the impact junior kindergarten would have on existing early childhood development programs. I was concerned that parents would have fewer choices for their 4-year-olds, and in fact, a year later, that's the case here in Yellowknife. I'm also concerned that pouring resources into JK has diminished what's available for children up to 3 years old. Mr. Speaker, the introduction of junior kindergarten has pushed Ecole St. Joseph School to maximum classroom capacity within their school, and Welladay isn't far behind. ECE has agreed to increase capacity at St. Joe's by investing $1.5 million in portable classrooms. This isn't counted as a cost of JK, but it is. The uptake in junior kindergarten has resulted in the loss of one classroom of 16 children at the Montessori School in Yellowknife, and they may lose another one in the fall. They are trying to stay viable by offering after-school and full-day daycare on professional development days. There have also been some changes at the Yellowknife Play School. Children are a lower average age, and that's resulted in adjustments, including a new focus on toilet training and purchasing age-appropriate play resources. Mornings are well attended, but afternoons have been harder to fill, resulting in an overall drop in income, the board says. Mr. Speaker, there have also been significant changes at the Aboriginal Head Start programs. They have lost most of their 4-year-olds, so their total numbers are down, and their funding is down as a result. Some programs have had challenges, but they continue as community-based language and culture programs for children ages 0 to 3. It's worth noting in this context that JK is still not fully funded for Aboriginal language and culture, with an overall shortfall of $300,000 across the N.W.T. Until that's resourced, Mr. Speaker, the Minister has not met his promise to fully fund JK. Mr. Speaker, it's by no means all bad news. ECE reports that 85% of 4-year-olds across the N.W.T are enrolled in JK, and they attend 8 days out of 10. That gives parents an opportunity to set children up for success at school. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Do I hear any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Colleagues, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What parents don't have is as much choice in programming for their 4-year-olds. JK is rapidly becoming the only option. I'm also concerned that it may be using up resources that used to be earmarked for early childhood development programs for children up to 3 years old. I'll have questions for the Minister. Massey.
Member statement, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it feels like spring has come early to the Mackenzie Delta. This means that ice roads will probably see a shorter season. Mr. Speaker, last year the access road to Acknowledgements closed early due to warm weather, and this year the Department of Infrastructure increased the minimum ice thickness requirements for the operation of ice roads. Increasing the minimum ice thickness means a longer wait for the road to open and a shorter season to use it. Mr. Speaker, the hamlet of Acknowledgements has 3 projects on the go that were scheduled to be completed by Christmas. The use of the road is required in order to bring in supplies, but the road opened later than usual after the ice thickness requirements were changed, and these projects are still delayed. I commend the Department of Infrastructure in reconsidering requirements for the safe operation of ice roads, but shorter seasons mean that our communities need to wait longer to get groceries and supplies, and our businesses are suffering. Mr. Speaker, I would like to see the Department of Infrastructure implement flexible requirements, such as allowing personal vehicles that are lighter to go on the road earlier than heavier semis and tanker trucks, or even consider reversing the thicknesses required, given that not all ice is the same. Mr. Speaker, shorter seasons due to a changing climate are made worse with the increase of the required ice thicknesses to operate ice roads. These changes have deep effects in communities that are not connected by land year-round. I urge the Department of Infrastructure to reconsider options for increasing the ice road season so that ice roads are kept open longer and our communities have enough time to get resupplied. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll have questions later today.
Member Statement, Member Tuneda-Williday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in approximately 4.5 months, Canada will be lifting a 95-year prohibition on cannabis and will formally legalize the recreation use of cannabis nationwide. This will truly be a monumental moment for both our country and for the world, because Canada will become only the second country in the world to legalize the consumption and sale of recreation cannabis. Overall, Mr. Speaker, I believe this move by the federal government is a smart one. Simply put, prohibition has not worked. I am glad that our country is finally ending the criminalization of people over cannabis. The lives of countless people have been disrupted due to harsh penalties for cannabis-related offences, as many people have received criminal records and have faced jail time for minor, non-violent drug offences. Mr. Speaker, I must also state that there are aspects of the legalization that I think have been overlooked. I'm referring specifically to amnesty for those who have been criminalized for cannabis-related offences. What will happen to people who are presently in jail for marijuana-related offences? Is Canada ready to modify sentences to let people out of jail? Will Canada pardon, suspend, or expunge criminal records related to marijuana? Mr. Speaker, we can look at California as an example. In 2016, California legalized the recreational use of marijuana, and contained within their legislation was a provision that enables people with prior marijuana convictions to be able to apply to the courts to have their convictions dismissed. This resulted in thousands of cannabis convictions dismissed from people's records and many people released from jails with reduced prison sentences. Mr. Speaker, according to a recent poll by Nanos Research, 62% of Canadians said they support pardons for people with marijuana possession convictions. There has also been numerous organizations, law firms, and advocates who have been urging the federal government to provide cannabis amnesty. I sincerely hope that if in fact our federal government does decide to provide cannabis amnesty, then our government here in the Northwest Territories will follow suit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Statement, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Today my member statement is going to be about expansion of École L'Incensier, and I'm going to attempt it in French. Aujourd'hui, j'ai une bonne nouvelle à annoncer dans le cadre.
I have good news. I have good news. You use the Taylor Road. We talk about the expansion that we've been waiting for so long at the LSN school, which we're going to work on. We finished the exterior structure, and we want to allow the Francophone students here to access to the same installations as children in other schools. The preferred pressure is particularly. There's some court challenges which have delayed this, and a lot of negotiation, a lot of planning, and a lot of requests for funding. The Francophone School Board, the Northwest Territories, Association of Parents, the parents and students who deployed hours of patience to the Minister of Education, Culture, and Minister of Infrastructure as well. The business people worked on the project. The expansion consists of a gymnasium with a wooden floor, of a kitchen, a specialized classroom. These new installations will be made available to the community as soon as each one is completed. The school is now used for other public events. This expansion should also allow us to improve the retention rate for the students and to make the LSN school more competitive relative to other secondary schools in your life. The improvement of these new site should take place at the end of the fall of 2018 to guarantee the new spaces are completely functional for the students and the various communities. The Francophone School Board has announced they're going to have a subscription program with the objective $150,000. These funds will be used to acquire electronic bulletin board for scoring in the gymnasium and some installation for the theater as well as equipment and kitchen utensils. I made a contribution in my name to this campaign to vote for the community. Invite all the other Yellowknife representatives to make a contribution as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member statement, Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, climate change is the most pervasive, overarching issue of our time. It's the one thing that is having a significant impact on everything else, and whether we like it or not, no government or community, no business or industry, and no individual or household will be able to avoid its impacts. And it's going to cost us big dollars. Those costs are already beginning to add up, Mr. Speaker. When water levels are lower, our hydro generation is less efficient, so we have no choice but to pay more for diesel. When our forests burn at an unprecedented rate, we have no choice but to protect communities and property. When shorelines erode, we have no option but to pay to relocate houses, repair roads, and fix the damage. When permafrost thaws, we have no choice but to spend more on heaving piles and roller coaster highways. Mr. Speaker, these impacts are already upon us, and with them, the incredibly high costs of repair. Frankly, these costs are not going away. In fact, they'll continue to grow for some time. The only viable solution, Mr. Speaker, is to do everything possible to reduce our carbon footprint. Let's embrace new technologies like solar and wind power so that we burn less fossil fuel. Let's support energy retrofit programs for our houses and buildings to save on energy use. Let's stop assuming that nuclear is a bad topic. Molten salt reactors have the potential to deliver affordable, clean, and safe energy that could support the mining industry without endangering the climate. Mr. Speaker, initiatives like these are essential as we move into the future, and we'll have to find the money for it while we adjust to paying the new carbon tax. While that tax is federally mandated, we have the opportunity to design the regime to suit our specific needs. So it's imperative that our carbon tax system supports the transitions we need to make, Mr. Speaker. Industry, transportation, and households need support to make the changes that will lead to a low-carbon future. The revenues from a new carbon tax must go back to them to help them make those changes. Anything less, and we will be failing our children's future and letting down the next generation. At the appropriate time, I'll have questions for the Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member statement, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too want to speak on the issue of climate change, as my honourable friend, the member for Yellowknife North did. Everyone from Her Majesty the Queen to His Holiness the Pope have addressed climate change as the key crisis facing the planet and future generations. And I'm really pleased to see so many leaders in the world step up. Just 10 years ago, there was still a debate on job-killing carbon taxes, and now everyone from industry to the grassroots are calling for carbon pricing as a method to curb carbon emissions and ultimately reduce the impact of our industries, our homes, and our communities have on increasing the rates of carbon tax, of climate change. You know, Northerners and Canadians know that polluting isn't free. Here in the Northwest Territories, we are affected most by climate change, and all of the Arctic is subject to extreme shifts in weather over recent years, and we have to do our part. And you know, I hear from a lot of people that a carbon tax will be a hardship, and potentially exemptions need to be sought. We need to find ways to get out of it. I hear that from this government as well, and I think we need to do our part to ensure that the cost of living is is not made unbearable by Northerners. We can't afford to have people leaving our communities. They deserve to have a stable and prosperous North for themselves and their families. But at the same time, we need to show real leadership and find a way to embrace a carbon pricing system that will protect our environment and show to the rest of Canada and the world that we are part of a progressive movement to address climate change definitively and to protect our future and the future of future generations as well. I believe we can do that. I know we can do that. I know my colleague, the Honourable Minister of Finance, is working diligently towards this. My questions for him later today are going to be where he is at. Because even though I know from my work on standing committees, a lot of work's going on, I think the public deserve an update because they have questions and I want to answer those questions with information I can provide them. So let's see if we can get it on the floor of the House. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member statements. Member statements. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize our pages we have from Acknowledgements in my writing. We have Tristan Ilanik and Tisha Cooey, also chaperone Liz Wright. I'd like to welcome you to the House and hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Yellowknife North constituent Arlene Hache and thank her for all the many years of service that she's provided in social advocacy. Thank you and welcome, and thank you for being here.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. The member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize two pages today working this week in the House, Phoenix Crivier Walsh and Harvey Hogiak Kulhak. Thank you for what you're doing.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize Ms. Arlene Hache, who's here as the Yellowknife representative for the N.W.T. Status of Women Council. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize a page from Yellowknife South, Liam Butt, and also all the other pages that have worked here this past few weeks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Yes, we're nearing the end of our session, so thank you to all the pages who've endured with us over the past 6 weeks. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. I too want to welcome all the visitors in the gallery. One who doesn't want to be recognized, so I won't mention her name, as well as Deborah Richards, a new constituency assistant. I don't think people realize how vital constituency assistants are to what we do. They're the first point of contact often for constituents, and they're integral to our system of government. So welcome. And of course, Ms. Arlene Hache, welcome. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member Nahende.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to follow up some questions dated back in May 31st and October 20th of 2016 with the Minister for Lands. There seems to be some confusion around the issue, and I'd like to try to clear it up once and for all. With the changes with the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs and the creation of lands, can the Minister please advise if the Department has all the files as it pertains to equity leases at Cassidy Point? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't speak for all of the files. I do know that The 41 properties out at Cassidy Point, those files are in the hands and have been reviewed by the Lands Department. I can't speak to other files in other departments from that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for clearing that up. In regards to the commitment made by the Department of Municipal Affairs in 1992, was this commitment made in an email or letter to all the residents, leaseholders at Cassidy Point? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, there was a commitment made many years ago to the Cassidy Point Prosperous Lake Leaseholders Association, and that has been supported by the previous Minister of Lands in the 17th Legislative Assembly. I'm not certain which department or which person actually made that commitment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not looking for the person or persons that made that commitment. I was asking if the minister is aware that there was a commitment made to the leaseholders, whether it was made in an email or a letter to the people, leaseholders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not certain as to the manner in which the commitment was made, but I do know that a commitment was made, which the government is prepared to honor and has been honoring. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question, Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the House, the minister was reading a document, and he said he couldn't share this document with us. So I guess I'm a little confused. Maybe he can clarify that. Was this document that he was reading an email or a letter to the leaseholders? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, I can't remember which document I was referring to. However, I can look into that and get some more information to the member opposite. Thank you.
Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal government has put in place a carbon backstop for jurisdictions that don't embrace their own carbon pricing model. I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance if he can speak to ongoing negotiations with the federal government over carbon pricing and whether or not he has prepared our own carbon pricing model for implementation here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have been working on our own carbon price modeling, and as we all know, the federal government has a backstop. They plan on implementing that backstop if the jurisdictions don't come up with their own modeling. So we've come up with some modeling, and we've updated committee on our approach to it. And once we have our discussions with the federal government, then we'll be able to share that information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the deadline the federal government is calling for is March 31st. Will the minister be prepared to share the carbon plan? Will the minister be prepared to implement our carbon plan before that deadline? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're just in the final stages of our modeling. We still need to have discussions with the federal government. Of course, at the end of the day, our goal is to mitigate the impact it's going to have on people in the Northwest Territories. So, again, once we've had those discussions, once we have more information to share, we will make it all public because the public needs to know. But we can't preempt our discussions with the federal government and release it to the public just yet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that we don't want to potentially impact the negotiations that would result in the backstop. I don't support the backstop model. I think we need our own Made in the North model. Can the minister assure us that we will get a Made in the North model and we won't be forced to accept the unfavorable backstop model that's being proposed by Ottawa, unfavorable to people in the Northwest Territories and my constituents? Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can assure the member and all members and the public that the N.W.T government is going to have a Made in the N.W.T approach to it, because we do want to mitigate the impact it's going to have on the high cost of living and doing business in the Northwest Territory. Also, I can add that the northern premiers have had some discussions. They all have some concerns with the federal backstop as well. They've had their discussions, and they will continue to do so. And as we move further into the process, I will continue to update committee and update members of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final question, member of Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that assurance. As the Minister knows, the Prime Minister of Canada committed to allow the N.W.T to keep all of the revenues raised from the carbon tax. So I've heard the Minister say that there's going to be a program that will mitigate any new taxes and that will impact our already too high cost of living. But the other part of this important piece of public policy is leading the way forward to a green economy with renewable energies and less carbon-intensive industry. Is the minister proposing a carbon plan that will do that as well? Because the only thing I heard in his past statements was mitigating the impacts of this on people's bottom line. That's important, but we also need to grow this economy towards a green, clean energy economy. Can the minister answer if that is part of the plan? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, member is correct. I mean, we have looked at a number of different options as to how we're going to roll this out. The engagement, a lot of the feedback we got from the engagement, there was a lot of suggestions in there as what we could do with revenue from the carbon pricing. So we've looked at a number of different options. I've laid out some of those options to committee. I'm looking for some feedback from committee as to our approach going forward. But again, I mean, I can assure the member and members of the public that our government is doing what we can to mitigate the impact not on the cost of living but the cost of doing business and the potential for investments into a greener economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions, member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from the honourable member from Cam Lake for the warm-up. My questions are to the Minister of Finance, and I'm going to go down the same lines as it relates to my member's statement on carbon taxation today. So I appreciate that the work that the Minister is doing, and especially with his federal counterparts, and I recognize that nothing is written in stone yet, and certainly don't want to compromise any negotiations that are going on between the two governments. But you know, can the Minister begin to tell us at least somehow or how he might be planning to structure the carbon tax revenue to help N.W.T residents and in particular businesses to transition into cleaner technologies? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out before, I mean, we have been doing some modeling. We've gotten a lot of feedback on our approach to carbon pricing and the effects it's going to have on the people in the Northwest Territory. I'd prefer not to get into too much detail right now as to the work we're doing, because we've had discussions with committee. We need to have the discussions with the federal government, and I don't want to preempt or jeopardize any discussions that we might have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the position, the difficult position that the Minister is in. And, you know, it seems that we're going to maybe get some repetitive answers, but this is the nature of question period. And so I'm going to put another one to the Minister as it relates to people that are, you know, of lower income, lesser income, sometimes a struggle with new forms of taxes. So maybe let's get off what the deal is between the federal government and the territorial government, and just maybe ask the minister what the minister intends to do with any form of a newfound tax as it relates to lowering the impacts that it'll have on folks with lower income levels. Will there be rebates or income assistance or what have you that would be available for these folks? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal government has come up with the carbon pricing. They have a federal backstop. I think the member previous to you spoke on the federal backstop and his non-support of it. And if we went with the federal backstop, then the cost would be a lot higher. We're coming up with a Made in the North approach that's going to look at a number of different groups across the Northwest Territories, and I assured the member previous that we are going to do what we can. We will do what we can to mitigate the effects of carbon pricing on all levels of people in the Northwest Territories. It's high on the radar of the Northern Premiers. They've had those discussions. We continue to have our discussions with Ottawa. In fact, I think I've just lined up a meeting for the end of the month with my federal counterparts. So we'll continue to have those discussions. Again, getting into the detail, once we have those discussions and I share the results of those discussions with committee, then we'll be able to have more public dialogue on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One last question that I have for the minister then today, and it's maybe it is a little bit relevant to what is going on between our two respective governments, but more so it's about investing in new technologies. And I'm just hoping that at the end of the day, the minister, this government can commit to transformational investments that will really affect our ability to lessen the impacts on climate change and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And so is the government looking at transformational type change? Are they looking at things such as nuclear, molten salt reactors, and of course connecting to the southern grid and providing much cheaper, affordable power to the north? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are. The government is always looking at transformational projects and ways we can lower the high cost of doing business and living in the Northwest Territories. So we continue to do that. I think the federal government has made it a priority theirs too. I mean, they've made a lot of investment in infrastructure across Canada, and the N.W.T has. We have our proposals in to get our share of some of that funding. So we are looking at a number of different projects that would help offset our greenhouse gas emissions and lowering the cost of living. And again, as we go further into the process, I would be glad to keep committee updated as to the work we're doing and seek their feedback. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. I have great hope that JK is going to improve student readiness for school and ultimately their success, and I'm sure the Minister does too. How is the development of students in JK going to be evaluated and when? Merci.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one way that we are measuring the evaluation of 4-year-olds in the education system is through our early development instrument. And then later on, we have the middle development instrument that we're introducing into the schools. And obviously, ultimately, at the end of the school year, the graduation rates either from elementary school or even through high school. So there's other areas that we're looking at. Mainly it's the early development instrument to make sure we watch the progress and then reevaluate again at the middle development instrument. And I agree with the member that I do believe this is going to have an impact on all of our schools and our education and the development of our students in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to the Minister for that response. Student achievement is one measure of this program, but I also have questions about value for money. So I'm wondering if there are other measures that the Minister is going to consider for junior kindergarten. Thank you.
Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's other ways. One way was everyone knows that junior kindergarten is optional for the parents, single parents even that enter their 4-year-olds into the junior kindergarten system. I did mention that it saves the families anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 per year. So on the family side of things, it's economically having an impact on some of the families across the Northwest Territories, and also areas that we're able to help the junior kindergarten's classrooms, as well as Aboriginal Head Starts. They were able to access the $5,000 one-time funding to get play-based materials into the school. But other than that, that's really it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister could tell us what the ratio of funding is for early childhood development initiatives versus early childhood development initiatives for children age birth to 3 versus the funding available for school. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year, when we fully implemented junior kindergarten throughout the territory, we had a budget in the 17-18 school year of $5.2 million. Our ECD budget throughout the territory was set at $8.91 million. I don't have the ratio of the education authorities to ECD, but our JK funding to ECD ratio is 1 to 1.7. And in this upcoming budget for 2018-19, we will have a junior kindergarten budget of $6 million, and then we'll also have an ECD budget of $11.6 million throughout the territory. So we're making very vast investments and improvements in how we operate with early childhood programs in the Northwest Territories, as well as our support for junior kindergarten throughout the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the detail the Minister was able to provide in his answer. I guess my last question is about the funding for early childhood development initiatives. I understand that there is money from Canada coming for early childhood development. Could the Minister talk about how that's going to be spent? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, and the member's right. We do have an agreement that we have signed, and we're just waiting for the announcement from the Government of Canada. That will increase the amount of funding that we will have in the Northwest Territories. As I mentioned in this House, we have 11 communities that don't have any early childhood programming outside of junior kindergarten that we implemented in the schools. And we want to ensure that we put a focus on those communities that currently don't have early childhood programming, and also continue to sustain other daycare spaces and daycare programs throughout the Northwest Territories, so that we do have accessible and affordable childcare in all 33 of our communities in the Northwest Territories. Thank you. And getting into more detail of how we're going to spend that money, once the announcement is said, once the announcement is made, I will brief committee, and I have made that offer to brief committee once that announcement is made. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, and I would like to recognize some visitors we have in the gallery before they take off. I believe it's a grade 9 class from Sir John Franklin High School in Yellowknife. So welcome. It's always nice to have an audience, and I'd like to see when the youth are engaged. Welcome. Oral questions, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to follow up on a motion that we passed unanimously in this House on October the 20th of last year, and it was with regard to an apology and compensation for damages from the giant mine. So I'd like to know whether the Premier has had a chance to write the letter to the Prime Minister as contemplated in the motion, and whether he can table that letter in the House before the end of the sitting. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I did write a letter to the Prime Minister as contemplated in the motion of October 20th, 2017, and I'll be tabling that letter probably tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Member for Frame Lake?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Premier for that, for the follow-up on the motion. I'd like to know whether there's been a response from the Prime Minister of Canada to that letter, and whether that response can be tabled in the House before the end of the sitting as well. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has responded, and the letter will be tabled likely tomorrow as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. While I'm on a roll here, and I want to thank the Premier for that as well, it'd be good to know if negotiations have started and whether there's a target date or any other kind of details on the process. Can the Premier tell us whether he is aware of any further progress on the issue of an apology and compensation for the damages from the giant mine? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, in his response, indicated and advised that he was forwarding my letter to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, and that since then it is my understanding that the Regional Director General for the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs has agreed to enter into discussions with the Yellowknife's Dene First Nations and is working with the chiefs to schedule a meeting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good, MLA.
Final question, member for Frame Lake?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. 3 for 3. Let's go for 4 for 4. Again, I want to thank the Premier for that. That's really great news. This is something people in this community have worked long and hard for, so I really appreciate the response from the Premier. So N.W.T is a co-proponent under the Giant Mine Environmental Agreement, and it's also a partner in the remediation of the site, not a financial partner, we'll be clear on that, through the 2005 cooperation agreement. Our staff have a lot of knowledge and information about Giant Mine and its impacts. Can the Premier tell us whether our staff will be supporting the work on an apology and compensation, and whether they have begun to be engaged on this issue? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware that our staff have been directly engaged as of yet, but we have a very good working relationship with the Federal Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, and we will endeavor to engage with them so that we continue to stay on top of this issue and help facilitate the resolution if we're able to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Tuneta-Willowday.
Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I talked about the amnesty for people that have been charged with marijuana offences in N.W.T. I recognize that this is a federal government initiative at this point. At some point, the N.W.T will be engaged. I'd like to ask the Minister of Justice if the department has statistically reviewed the situation with the numbers of people that have been charged with criminal offences due to marijuana. Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can advise that the Department does not keep statistics on the number of N.W.T residents with convictions for simple possession or otherwise, and it may be that some of them will have convictions arising from other jurisdictions. I was looking at an article, however, by an Andre Picard, which seemed to indicate there was still a large number of people across Canada being charged, And he indicated in that article that, as I read it, there were more than 40,000 convictions, or charges rather, cannabis-related charges laid in 2016. So there are a large number of people that are still being charged. I'm assuming that some of them are N.W.T residents, but we don't have those statistics. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Trinetta-Williday.
Mr. Speaker, even without statistics, I'd like to ask the minister if there has been any discussion with his department on how to handle I guess it's going to be a huge amount of individuals that have been charged with. In the case I spoke of in my member statement, simple possession, as the minister indicates, I was wondering if there was any discussions at all at the departmental level with pertaining to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned previously, this matter is primarily a federal one. Excuse me. I do know that some time ago, the Department of Justice and EC&E established a program whereby clients on social assistance could receive financial assistance to obtain a record suspension, which is the modern term for a probation. As I say, there may be a lot of applications for record suspensions or a pardon rather coming ahead, and unfortunately it does seem that there's still a large number of charges being laid. As I mentioned previously, tens of thousands are still being, charges are being laid. I don't think the federal government is contemplating any change in their policy with respect to pardons for marijuana charges until after the current legislation regarding the legalization of recreational cannabis comes into effect. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member Trinetta-Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do realize that we're talking about legal, the legal stuff here, but had there been any discussions, like at some point we must begin to talk about what's going to be coming in July. I'd like to know if there's been any discussions between the minister and his colleagues in cabinet. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I cannot discuss the details of what is discussed in Cabinet. However, we do realize this is a live issue, and it is a live issue for the federal government also. I do know that as recently as earlier this year, and I'm reading a story in the press, that the federal Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, said the government is examining the implication of possible pardons or record suspensions. So this is an issue mainly at the federal level, and I think we could all say that we are expecting some movement by them with respect to the issue of past convictions, but time will tell. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question, Member Trinetta-Williday.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking about these questions because it does certainly have an impact on individuals with jobs, employment, travel, and many other things when an individual has a criminal record is appearing at the border, for example. Whether or not they are able to cross the border could depend upon what type of criminal offense they have on their record. So I'd like to ask the minister if he could commit to starting to have discussions with the other ministers that have some involvement in creating employment and having the growth of our economy in the territory, so that they have that discussion, so that when July 1st comes and the legislation is passed, that this government would be more prepared than not prepared. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it has been a challenge for this government to prepare for the upcoming legalization of recreational cannabis, and certainly I am willing to discuss these matters with my colleagues in Cabinet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member's statement. A little background is in the past, the ice roads opened at a weight limit of 25 millimeters, and today the changes that were made were you now have to have 35 millimeters to open the road. So I'd like to ask the minister, will the minister be more flexible as we tend to have colder weather in the Mackenzie Delta compared to the southern part of our territory? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the member's not talking about this winter. I think the Mackenzie Delta has been warmer than yours. So I'll have to check into the significant change from the 25 millimeter to the 35 millimeter for operation of the ice roads. But I do know that, and I've said it in this House a number of times, safety is our #1 priority for residents of the Northwest Territories. We have guidelines for safe ice construction of ice roads in the Northwest Territories, and I'll endeavor to have a look into why the change took place from 25 to 35 millimeters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last spring, as we're all aware, the ice road closed quicker on the ice road to Aklavik. It was due to a little open section of water. Mr. Speaker, all we had to do at the time was block off a section of that road to ensure that vehicles didn't go near that open water, which was just alongside the road. So will the minister block off any open sections along the ice road this spring rather than closing the road altogether? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I'll say no to that just to protect myself, but there's a number of circumstances that have to be taken into consideration on the closure of these ice roads. One of the things is, as I said, we have a guideline around how we operate the ice roads in Northwest Territories. Climate change is impacting how the government of Northwest Territories operates and how we build and maintain these ice crossings in the N.W.T, and has become a significant challenge. Even this year, we're having some challenges right now with a number of overflow issues on a number of the roads. And they're going to actually bring the cost up of operating these things continually as we go forward. I think the member from Yellowknife mentioned that in his comments about climate change, how it's affecting us. We have warmer water that is flowing under the ice, and it can degrade the ice surface, the thickness of it, and it's not visible to the naked eye, and people assume that the road is just because the ice conditions look on the surface as they could be operated and it's cool out. Warmer waters and river currents and stuff is having an effect on these things, and we have to continue to monitor them, and we will continue to do that, but safety is our #1 priority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister talked about increased cost. Maybe if the minister would listen to our some of the things that we're trying to let them know of to bring the costs down, maybe those costs would be half as what they are today, like heat trace, for example. But the other question I had was, you know, our contractors up in the area have years of experience with these conditions, and even your colleague next to you knows of this area that we're talking about, and over the years it's been the same conditions in that area. And you know, the people have a lot of traditional knowledge in that area. You know, this spring, I'm sure we may have to do it again, but will the minister ensure that the department tests the ice in that area to ensure it's safe? And if we have to block off a little section of the road, maybe a quarter or half, then just especially for light traffic, because it is safe for light traffic, and to let the residents, give them time to stock up for this spring, and you know, they won't have access to that road until next fall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree. The contractors have a lot of experience in that region building these ice roads. It's been the same contractors off and on for a number of years. But at the end of the day, I'm the minister whose head's on the line here if something happens. Safety is our #1 priority. We will continue to monitor the situation going forward. I can talk to the department if there's any issues arising right now on that section of highway in the Northwest Territories. As I've said, I know a number of our ice roads have challenges right now. And as you can see by the weather outside, it's going to increase. When it's +6 in Hay River right now, there's challenges right across the board. But safety is our #1 priority. I will talk to our department. We'll have our superintendent have a look at the road and make sure it's safe to operate for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to follow up with questions to the Minister of Lands. Can the Minister explain to this House how the Yellowknife Dene First Nations were consulted in regards to the land at Cassidy Point? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do know that there was consultation, and make sure I get my dates right, that in December, formal consultation, December 2014 that is, the department sent formal consultation letters regarding the possible fee simple transfer to the Acacho Territory Dene First Nations, ADFN, Northwest Territories Métis Nation, North Slave Métis Alliance, and Clecho Government. Copies of the letters were also sent to the Yellowknives Dene First Nation chiefs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm a little bit concerned. This started in 1992, and if I heard the minister say correctly, it was 2014 when we consulted with the First Nation, so maybe he'll have to clarify that a little bit later. But I guess my concern is, my understanding, the Yellowknife Dene did not support the sale of this area to leaseholders. So how was the government able to move forward with this commitment? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
My understanding, Mr. Speaker, is that when the letters were sent out on December 14th, 2014 to the groups that I have already mentioned, a request was made that, or the consultation period with respect to those letters ended on February 3rd, 2015, which would have been about 60 days later, and by that time, no Aboriginal governments responded to either support or object to the proposal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find that hard to believe that the First Nations would not object to this, but I guess I'll go on to my next question. Has the government of the N.W.T compensated the Yellowknife Dene First Nations for taking this pieces of land and for that happening? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, letters were sent out to the groups I mentioned, and no responses, negatively or positively, were received by February 3rd, 2015, which, as I said, was approximately 60 days later. No compensation has been paid, as I understand it, to this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question, member for Nahende.
And I thank the minister for that answer. So on October 20th, 2016, the minister spoke about the importance of the government of the Northwest Territories honoring its commitments no matter how old they are. It comes with the honor of the crown. In speaking with a number of residents, we're not too sure what the minister meant by this. Can the minister please explain to the House what he meant by this statement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As all the members of this House know, a commitment was made many years ago to the people at Cassidy Point, allowing them to obtain fee simple, period. That was the end of it, we thought, but it is a little more complicated than that, simply because the people out at Cassidy Point doubtless relied on this assurance from the government. So there's two reasons why the government must follow up on its commitment, honor of the Crown as I call it. One, we made the commitment, as I said, and doubtless people affected relied on that promise. So there's two reasons why we must follow through on this promise, and that is in keeping with the honor of the Crown. Thank you.
Oral questions, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to ask some questions of the Minister of Finance about the renewal of our territorial formula funding arrangement. Buried on page 317 of the federal budget, there's this set of curious numbers and so on. It says proposed renewal of equalization and territorial formula funding for a 5-year period with technical changes to improve accuracy and efficiency of calculation of entitlements and so on. So this seems to indicate that our territorial formula funding arrangement is going to be renewed for another 5 years as is. I'm just wondering if the Minister of Finance can shed any light on what this commitment from the federal government is all about. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in this year's federal budget, they announced that we were going to get an additional $1.7 million towards our formula financing as a result of the negative impacts of the review of the territorial formula financing that they just completed. The current deal expires on April 9th. The member is correct. We are getting renewed for the next 5 years, and my understanding is the 1.7 for the next 5 years. We should get incremental increases actually to our budget to offset the negative impacts of the review. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that. I'm just worried about the renewal of the agreement for another 5 years. There's going to be there are issues here in terms of carbon pricing. There's a commitment from the federal government to ensure that any impacts on the TFF with regard to carbon pricing are going to be dealt with. We know that we don't get to keep enough of our own source revenues under the TFF. So is there still going to be an opportunity? I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance if there's still going to be an opportunity to make further changes to the formula funding arrangement with regard to carbon pricing and own source revenues. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, in my response to the questions from the two members previous, I had talked about the carbon pricing and the effect it might have on the territorial formula financing, and that's part of the discussions that we'll have with Ottawa is on how that may affect our territorial formula financing. I know we've had commitment from the federal government that they were going to recognize the uniqueness of the North, so we're hoping they take that into consideration. And as we proceed into those discussions, again, I will commit to keeping members updated on the discussions that we have on the own source revenue. We keep all our own source revenue, except for the resource royalties, which we just started receiving a few years ago. I mean, part of that goes back to Canada. We get a portion of that, but all the other own source revenue we keep within the territorial government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that. My understanding was that if we, I'm not an expert on the territorial formula funding arrangement, but my understanding was that if we introduced a new tax, we get to keep the revenues from that for the first 3 years, and then it gets rolled into our base and sort of clawed back through the arrangement. So is there going to be the ability to change that sort of provision of the arrangement so that we get to keep more of our own source of revenues in the future? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm positive that we get to keep all the revenue that we generate, but I will confirm that and have a conversation with the member. I have raised in the last finance ministers meeting that are concerned about the impact of some of the technical changes that they have, and so I've started those discussions with the federal finance minister. But I'm sure that we get to keep all the revenue that we generate. Again, I will confirm that, and if I was wrong, then I will let the member know. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final question, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I think I'd like to get a briefing. I think the Standing Committee should probably get a briefing on the formula funding arrangement pretty soon, so we better understand this. But even with regard to, say, the resource revenues that we get to keep under the devolution agreement, there was an independently commissioned study by Department of ITI that said that that arrangement wasn't the greatest, that we should be able to keep more of those sorts of revenues as a result of changes that could be made to the territorial formula funding arrangement and maybe the devolution agreement. But how open is the minister aware of what sort of opportunities there are going to be to renegotiate other provisions of the territorial formula funding arrangement if it's renewed for 5 years? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the resource royalty revenues, I mean, we started receiving those revenues at devolution. Before that, for a number of years before that, I don't believe we got any resource, any revenue at all from the resources that were extracted from the Northwest Territories. So it was a long time coming, and it's a start, and hopefully we'll continue to see that pot of money increase in the future, which would mean that there'd be more jobs in the Northwest Territory. Again, a member makes a good point, though. The territorial formula financing that we have with the federal government is quite complex. There's a number of different components to it, and if it's a wish of committee, I would be pleased, or be glad to provide them with a briefing, be it a written briefing or an in-person briefing, a technical briefing, and then we can all better understand territorial formula financing. But my understanding, again, is that we get to keep all our own source revenue that we generate. Otherwise, why would we raise taxes or anything like that if we're not able to keep it? And so, again, I'll have that discussion with committee, and we'll see as we go forward that we're all better informed on the territorial formula financing agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure. As Infrastructure is the department that handles our energy policy for this government, earlier today, the Honourable Member for Yellowknife North spoke about nuclear energy as a potential solution to remote industrial operations in the high Arctic and as a solution for off-grid mines. And I know that many industry actors who are operating in the Northwest Territories have been looking into the potential of nuclear technology. I haven't heard a lot from this government on its position on nuclear. Do we have one, Mr. Speaker? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nuclear is an interesting conversation. I think if you read the documents, we're interested in all new technologies that are coming down the pipe to help us meet the energy crunch that's coming and the greenhouse gas reductions that we all have to meet. The Nuclear Board of Canada was at the Arctic Energy Conference in Nunavut to participate. They were there with a contingency of a few people to pay attention to what's going on and the needs across the north. And we continue to follow the nuclear technology as it improves across the country. At PDAC, I ran into the federal parliamentary secretary, who she was having a meeting with many nuclear people on how it could be implemented in the country. But that's a long ways off. This thing has to go through some strict rationale and how it's going to be used safely in our country, and I don't know, not quite sure if the technology is even there to be implementing it at this point, but we are definitely following it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the Minister for clearing that up. I'm glad that this government is on the case. I think nuclear is one of those areas of energy that gets a bad rap because of some very high-profile global disasters. But that shouldn't persuade us away from looking at the potential. Canada has had nuclear reactors operating in southern provinces for many years, such as in Ontario, who has a famously successful nuclear program that hasn't had any major problems. I'd like to ask the minister if he is aware of any provincial or territorial jurisdiction that could allow us to pursue our own nuclear program without involving without the federal government having to design it for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe anything that pertains to nuclear energy in this country has to follow the jurisdiction of the federal government. As I've said, though, we're paying close attention to how this is rolling out. I've had a few documents that actually crossed my desk that people have sent me about it. As innovation comes along and technology changes, I'm sure it's no different than the impacts of climate change. This is something that's coming. It's something I think that not just the Northwest Territory is going to have a look at it as the energy needs of the future come, but it's a global thing that I think many nations are going to have to look at. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the industry has been looking at this technology, including industry working in similar conditions and potentially in the Northwest Territories themselves. If industry is pursuing, does the minister know if there are any industrial energy projects that the N.W.T could potentially partner with and work with the federal government to move nuclear projects forward in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of any large industrial components that are interested in doing this. We know, as I've stated, I don't believe the technology is theirs yet, and this is something that we're just keeping an eye on moving forward and how we can maybe implement it in the future once it becomes a reliable source of energy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final question, member for Cam Lake.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for responding on an area that there's not much meat on the bones, so to speak. But there's a public concern over the use of this technology. I think we're all reminded of some public engagement that went on earlier in this term. Clearly, if this is the way of the future, and the minister is confident that the industry is moving in this area and economies are moving in this area, is he willing to commit to putting a discussion paper together or some talking points that can be shared with the public so we can get Northerners in on the conversation and allay any hesitation they have in embracing technology, which, as he said, is on the way to being normative in Western civilization? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, our energy strategy moving forward talks about all the types of future innovative and different technologies that are coming down the pipe. At this point, I don't think I'm going to put our resources into putting a paper into something that's is probably quite a distance out, but we will continue to monitor it going forward, and if some more information that crosses my desk, I think that's going to be relevant to the conversation of how we do the energy mix to lower our greenhouse gas emissions for the Northwest Territories. At that time, I'll look at bringing it out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to go back into my role as the honorary member for the Sawtooth with some questions about the Norman Wells Fire Department for the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs. Last week we had a conversation about the status of the Norman Wells Fire Department. My question for the minister is whether it's operating today. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I'm actually appreciate being asked the question so I can clarify some of the information. As stated last week, the Norman Wells Fire Department was not shut down. That was an error on the behalf of the media. We have been since before the Auditor General report, we've been going in and doing assessments of community fire departments. We've done 15 so far, and each one of those comes with recommendations. Norman Wells was identified as the need for more training, and there were some issues regarding the qualifications of the fire people to be able to operate some of the equipment. So we scaled back a bit, but we did not close down the department. So just to clarify that it is still operational. They are in need of some training, and we are currently working with them to make sure that training happens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll answer to that also. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the answer. It sounds like there was very poor communication that happened between the town of Norman Wells, its personnel, and the department and so on. Are there some lessons learned there? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, again, there's always lessons learned when anything, when things go good and when things go bad. There's always lessons to be learned. So within that one, again, I have to focus that the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs is not in charge of all the fire departments. That is a community issue, but we do work with them closely to provide the support, the training, and the services that they need to make sure that they're functioning well. There was a breakdown in communication. So we've talked with the council. So they're going to actually be on this Monday coming up, March 19th. The town administrator and with Municipal and Community Affairs on side, we'll be having an interagency meeting in the afternoon, and then we'll be having a public meeting in the evening so that people in the community can actually hear and dispel any fears that they may have. The Office of the Fire Marshal is also going to meet with the Fire Department on Monday and Tuesday, the 19th and the 20th, to put in some details on the implementation plan and how we're going to get their team up to standards with the training necessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it sounds like this issue is well on its way to being resolved. My only remaining concern is that in the reporting on this issue, the reporter tried the fire line on Friday and got no answer. Does the minister have any information on whether the fire emergency line is operational? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's new news to me. I have also concerns if someone is trying to phone a fire line and doesn't get through. I would like to say that the community, the council should be available at all times. We will check into that. I do know there may have been a glitch. They're just in the process of hiring a brand new fire chief, and the new chief is going to start work in early April. That's still no excuse. So I will look into it to make sure that if people call for support, emergency support, that somebody is going to answer that phone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to the Commissioner's opening address. Replies to the Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committee on the review of bills. Tabling of documents. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Questions 181-18(3) Midwifery Programs and Policies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Thursday, March 15th, 2018, I will move the following motion. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on March 15th, 2018, it shall be adjourned until Thursday, May 24th, 2018. And further, that at any time prior to May 24, 2018, if the Speaker is satisfied after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife Centre. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. Bill 9, Appropriation Act, Operations, Expenditures 2018-2019. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, that Bill 9, Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2018-2019 be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. I had a premonition there. Second reading of bills. Pardon me? Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Second reading of bills. Bills, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to do second reading of bills. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, that Bill 7, Chartered Professional Accountants Act, be read for the second time. This bill, like the parallel statute to be introduced in Nunavut, establishes the organization of Chartered Professional Accountants, which will be responsible for regulating the profession of accounting in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. This bill merges the existing professions of certified general accountant, certified management accountant, and chartered accountant into a single profession and repeals the statutes governing these formerly separate professions. Some of the key provisions of this bill concern the following matters: setting out the powers of the organizations to manage its affairs, including the powers to hold property, borrow money, make bylaws, and elect a governing board; setting out rules respecting the practice of the profession and reserving the chartered professional accountant designations to members of the organization; setting out rules respecting the membership and licensing of members of the organization; setting out the powers of the organization to establish requirements for members, including ethical and professional standards of conduct and continuing competency requirements; setting out rules respecting the making and investigation of complaints against members and the conduct of discipline proceedings, including appeals; providing that the organization may exercise powers and functions for the regulation of the profession in Nunavut, and providing for transitional measures, including preserving registrations affected and proceedings taken under the former governing statutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. To the principle of the bill. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 7 has had its second reading and is referred to standing committee. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 9, Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2018-19 be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill authorizes the government of the Northwest Territories to make appropriations for operation expenditures for the 2018-19 fiscal year. It also sets out limits on amount that may be borrowed by the Commissioner on behalf of the government, includes information in respect of all existing borrowing and all projected borrowing for the fiscal year, and authorizes the making of disbursements to pay the principal of amounts borrowed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
To the principle of the bill. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to speak to the principle of this bill. It was a month ago that I gave my reply to the budget address. So what has changed since then in terms of the 2018-19 budget, now that we have an appropriation bill in front of us? I want to talk a little bit about the budget process. The reductions in this budget are not as drastic as in the previous 2 fiscal years, but Cabinet continues to cut programs and services to build larger surpluses to spend on infrastructure projects or roads to resources. The promised spending in the last 2 years of our mandate is limited to a few new initiatives, and this was the approach even before the reduced revenues were announced. In November 2017, regular MLAs reviewed the departmental business plans. Phase 2 reductions appear in many of the departmental budgets. Overall, the business plans often did not contain enough information for us to understand what specific activities were to be undertaken in 2018-19. Regular MLAs sent detailed correspondence listing unacceptable reductions and recommended investments and provided supporting rationales for our positions. The response was that revenues were lower than anticipated and further study was needed by Cabinet. When the full response was received, Cabinet refused to make any of the changes requested by regular MLAs. Another exchange of letters took place, and then Cabinet finally agreed to about $1 million of changes after regular MLAs began to defer departmental budget consideration in Committee of the Whole. That's the changes that we asked for were less than 1/1000th of a percentage of the total budget. At least the changes that we've got in the appropriation bill before us and the supplementary appropriations that are to come. As I said last year, few will ever know how hard the regular MLAs had to work together on behalf of our residents to extract any concessions from Cabinet. Budgets also serve to focus discussions and debate on policy and programs. One lesson that we can take away from this is that responses to commitments made in Committee of the Whole reviews of departmental budgets should be prepared in a more timely fashion. How can we make the budget process more productive next time around? There needs to be earlier, meaningful consultation with regular MLAs about the overall fiscal context and direction of the budget, even before the development and review of the business plans. The review of the business plans was rushed this time because of the change in schedule resulting from the midterm review and other factors. The business plans themselves need to be significantly improved, and ministers need to be better prepared. I think we also need to develop a process convention for the budget. I'd like to talk a little bit now about some of the details in the budget. There will be some welcome new investments in the social envelope, including youth mental health and stronger support for FASD and autism. I support these initiatives. There are even some new initiatives related to the environment, including completion of the Protected Areas Network and support for communities dealing with climate change. Unfortunately, these environmental initiatives are funded by internal cuts within Environment and Natural Resources. On the economic side, I support the increased investment in agriculture, but there is really no serious effort to diversify our economy. Additional funding is being devoted to land rights negotiations, which is welcome, but it comes after 2 years of cuts in such funding. Little work is underway to develop a knowledge economy, and the future of Aurora College is still very much up in the air. The only new revenue initiative in this budget is the proposal to study a land transfer tax and the continued study of a sugary drink tax that is carried over from the previous year. I cannot accept Cabinet's approach of continual cutting without some corresponding and commensurate effort at raising new revenues. I will repeat my words from my 2017 reply to the budget address. The world, this country, and the N.W.T. have witnessed growing and unparalleled gaps between rich and poor. Our government has done little to address this issue through the tax system. In my reply to the budget address last month, I said the following: the public would be shocked to learn that we will raise more money from tobacco taxes, $16 million, than we get from resource royalties, $13 million. There has been no serious efforts by Cabinet to stabilize and increase our own source revenues. So much for the promise of devolution, where our government would do a better job managing resources than the federal government. After almost 4 years after devolution, not one word of the mere legislation or regulations has been changed. We can and should be raising significantly more from mining, as shown by 2 independent experts who have recently examined our revenues from this sector. A review of mining royalties has been put off to some unspecified future date and is very unlikely to be completed within the life of this Assembly. Why should the federal government give this government any more authority over lands and resources when we haven't done anything with the authority we have? My experience over the past month just reinforces my belief in these statements. Some of the specific reductions in 2018-19 that I believe are particularly short-sighted and harmful are highlighted as follows. The environment continues to be a low priority with Cabinet. There is no new investment in renewable or alternative energy as we wait for federal dollars to rain from heaven. The 2016 sunsetting of $760,000 of funding leveraged by regular MLAs during the bailout of the N.W.T. Power Corp for diesel to replace hydropower during low water levels was never replaced in the Arctic Energy Alliance budget. When regular MLAs proposed increases to the funding for Arctic Energy Alliance, this has been rejected. Within Environment and Natural Resources, the cutting of 5 positions at headquarters, 4 of these in corporate management, that are related to communications, policy, and legislation, has seriously reduced the capacity of the department. It has a lot on its plate with at least 6 legislative proposals, major public policy initiatives, including the Climate Change Strategic Framework, and a heavy communications responsibility with caribou and fire management. This work is already well behind schedule, and it is not at all related to the lack of effort by the staff who I have publicly commended. The problem is with the lack of funding and staff to get the job done. ENR is again one of the few departments to continue to take cuts, and more are planned in the next 2 years. Boreal caribou monitoring is to be cut by $150,000 at a time when the species has been listed as threatened, and when a recovery strategy is under consideration that will call for more monitoring, not less. We have seen numerous examples of government withdrawing funding when there's a hint of federal funding, cutting our commitments to fund infrastructure, to fund boreal caribou monitoring is simply wrong. Funding for the district education authorities is also to be cut by $200,000 as part of Cabinet's fiscal reduction targets. The hope is that some sort of shared services approach will yield these savings. MACA will cut $250,000 from its budget for multi-sport game support, as the lottery funds may now be used for that purpose. There will be further cuts over the next year as well. Lastly, while I appreciate and support the changes being made in the N.W.T. Housing Corporation, there is still no plan or funding to get our housing out of core need. Cabinet appears to have already decided that not 1 cent of the recently announced federal infrastructure funding is going to be used for housing as well. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this is a better budget as a result of regular MLAs working together on behalf of all of our residents. I'm proud of the regular MLAs for having pushed for improvements, and I'm very happy to continue to work together with them. However, even with the minor changes, there are significant cuts, especially to the environment, and little to no effort or even consideration of new revenue sources. The overall direction from Cabinet's fiscal reduction strategy of cutting jobs, programs, and services to fund infrastructure continues in this budget. There are some exciting initiatives in this budget, and I sincerely thank my Cabinet colleagues and their staff and my regular MLA colleagues for much hard work. However, on balance, I cannot support the 2018-19 budget, given the focus on spending reductions to fund infrastructure and very limited effort to look at revenues. I will be voting against the appropriation bill. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. To the principal of the bill, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my reply to the budget address, I spoke of the process that led us to what we've been doing for the past several weeks in the chamber of this House. And although I was dissatisfied with how that process played out, and that I felt we could have had more engagement on both sides of the House to build a budget we could all support. At the end of the day, we were forced into a situation where it's taken us till this point to bring forward an appropriation bill. In ideal circumstances, we'd have more time to work on these issues, to find compromise, and I think that's the real spirit of democracy. I've often said that it's not about making everyone happy, but it's about creating a budget or a bill or a proposal that everyone can live with and that our constituents can live with as well. And that's important, Mr. Speaker. And I feel that we have done that with this appropriation bill. I'm not going to speak to at length to the contents of the bill itself and of the budget that we'll be moving forward with in 1819, as I expect it will pass today. But I do want to say that many of the most troubling concerns around some of the directions the budget was taking with policy decisions and spending were resolved through the great amount of work that members on both sides of the House did over the Committee of the Whole reviews, and that are often not as exciting as question period in the day-to-day business of the Assembly, but are very important because they allow us to ask these questions and do an in-depth review on each department's budget. And ultimately, that work has been exhaustive. Every dollar has been accounted for, every spending proposal has been questioned, and at the end of the day, we have made progress on arts funding, we have made progress on land tenure issues, we have made progress on environmental concerns, we have made progress on business support. There are other policies that will still need to be worked out, and I expect we'll spend the remainder of this term doing that. But again, I can't look at this budget and see something I can't support. Rather, I see something that I acknowledge has taken a lot of work to get to the place it is today, and that work has ultimately made a better budget, a more balanced document, and helped get the information contained within its pages out to our constituents, so they understand how the government is spending their money on improving services and programs to Northwest Territories residents. And finally, on the coming infrastructure budget and the need to continue to invest in that infrastructure budget, which is something I do support, the nature of our financial procedures requires us to pay for that infrastructure budget from what may appear as an operational surplus. It can also be thought of as the capital budget. What we don't spend on these programs and services, we're going to be spending on capital. I would disagree with the argument that it is potentially an area to cut services to pay for infrastructure. I think rather we need more common sense budgeting practices that allow everyone to understand exactly what we're doing when we move forward. We're not posting surpluses year on year. We're paying for capital, and the way we do that is somewhat complex. So we need plain language, common sense budgeting that everyone can follow along with, everyone can understand, and ultimately respects that there are two budgets at play here. One is capital, one is operations maintenance. That is the one before us today. That is how we pay for programs and services. And I'm satisfied that this government is using its limited resources in a time of reduced revenues to maximize the gains made to Northerners and to address the most pressing issues that regular members have brought to the floor of the House and have successfully championed over the last weeks of this sitting of the Legislative Assembly, and I will be supporting the appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. To the principal of the bill, Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand here to speak on the principle of this appropriation bill. I guess my biggest challenge was the big cut of another $250,000 of the multi-sport games. This is now $500,000 cut from multi-sport games, and this is having a huge impact on our youth and our residents, especially our future. When speaking with the finance minister, this was my struggle, this is my challenge. This is something I stand up on my principles. However, as we work forward, and you got to look at the big picture and look at a number of the issues here, the big issue in my riding I represent is mental health issues. The 4 new positions, the child and youth care consultants or counselors, is huge in my riding. You've heard me speak about the challenges we faced in the riding, and the positions now are going, one in Fort Liard, one in Fort Providence and one in Fort Simpson, and there's going to be a manager. This is going to help address this issue. It's a first step, and it's a positive step. And I have to congratulate the Department of EC&E and the Department of Health and Social Services for working on this and making it a positive step. They have a plan. They're trying to address it. They're starting with the Cleat Show and the Henday riding right now, / date show, and then they're moving on for the next few years. Autism and fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, that another is a big issue, and I appreciate the government putting some money towards it. It is now addressing this issue, and it's helping our residents be better prepared in this issue. You've heard me talk about equity leases here as an issue. It's been an issue ever since I've got here. Me and the Minister of Department of Lands have had a number of conversations, questions on the floor here, and I have to applaud the government of Northwest Territories and Cabinet for recognizing this need. We now have put in 5 positions there, and we're now looking forward to making a deal with this in the next 3 years. That is a huge step for the residents of the Northwest Territories. We have a number of equity leases out there across the territories, and we need to address this. These are people who are homeowners, they're taxpayers, and they want to deal with this matter. And I applaud the department for dealing with that. Adding 2 government service officers. In the small communities, these positions are huge. They have a huge impact on the riding for the residents. They address these issues. They're the first line. I think it's what I was told, a single window service. And this is having a huge impact. The department has heard us and is dealing with this matter. They're coming up with a plan to get into all the smaller communities, and I applaud the department for that. I've seen firsthand how these positions have an impact in 2 of my communities that I represent, Fort Liard and Handy Butte. Those 2 positions are amazing. They have a huge, do a lot of work for the residents, and they're a good conduit for myself as the government as we're trying to get information out to people. The next issue is leases from 10%, which is reasonable in some people's world, to 5%. I tried to push it for 3%, and I applaud the minister for actually looking at this and the department for looking at this and reducing it at least to 5%. Because it now has a huge impact on all residents of the Northwest Territories, not any specific riding. It's all residents that are dealing with this matter. So I applaud the department for that. Again, I would love to see it at 3%, but at least at 5%, we're seeing money back into people's pockets. The last one I'd like to talk about is the increase to arts funding. The arts funding, we've heard it, we've seen it, we've had meetings where the arts community asked for an increase in funding, $200,000 for increased funding. We were able to work with the departments and the government to come up with an additional $200,000, which will help these people and help us promote our art world. So, Mr. Speaker, when I first started out going through this process, I was really challenged to support this budget. People have seen me stand and rise in this House and not support the last 2, but I have to applaud the departments, the government for working with us. We're not going to all have the positive relationship that we want. We don't want to get everything that we need, but I have to applaud the department and the ministers for working with us on this. It's a long process. There's a lot of letters written back and forth, a lot of communication behind the scenes, but I applaud the department and my colleagues on this side here for working together for the residents of N.W.T. So at this point in time, I'll be supporting the budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. To the principal of the bill. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Bill 9 has had its second reading. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Minister Statement 1-18(3) North Slave Correctional Complex Inmate Concerns. Minister Statement 19-18(3) Aurora College Foundational Review Process. Table Document 135-18(3) Supplementary Estimates Infrastructure Expenditures Number 4 2017-2018. Table Document 136-18(3) Supplementary Estimates Operations Expenditure Number 4 2017-2018. with member for Mackenzie Delta in the chair.
Thank you, committee. I now call committee of the whole to order. Mr. Bolio, what's the wish of committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to consider table document 135-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 4 2017-2018 and table document 136-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates operations expenditures number 4 2017-2018. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you, committee. We'll continue after a short recess. Thank you. Thank you, committee. I now call committee of the whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider table document 135-18 brackets 3 titled Supplementary Estimates Infrastructure Expenditures number 4 2017-2018. Does the Minister of Finance have any opening remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm here to present supplementary estimates, infrastructure expenditures number 4, 2017-2018. This document provides for an increase of $2.4 million to the capital budget. These supplementary estimates include $1.5 million for the purchase of 4 portables for St. Joseph's School in Yellowknife and $900,000 toward the construction of a new fish plant in Hay River. This expenditure will be fully offset by revenue from the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency. That concludes my opening remarks, Mr. Chair. I am prepared to respond to the committee's questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. We have agreed to begin with general comments. Does the Minister of Finance wish to bring witnesses into the House?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Of arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Would the Minister please introduce his witnesses?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to my right, I have Mr. David Sturt, who is Deputy Minister, Department of Finance. To my left, I have Mr. Sandy Kugluktar, Deputy Secretary to the FMB. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. I will now open the floor for general comments. Mr. Tessert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just wanted to speak to, not a question, just a comment. I support this supplementary estimate or the requested appropriation, or in particular the 1.5 million for the purchase of 4 portables at St. Joseph's School. That school is in my riding. It's the largest elementary school in the Northwest Territories. I have risen in this House before to speak about the space needs of the school. I think, and this is something that the school district was looking to bring forward. So I'm very pleased that the government is providing assistance to the school district, Yellowknife Catholic Schools, in the purchase of these portables, and that we're going to take some of the pressure off the space needs at École Saint-Joseph. And I hope that moving forward, we continue to support our partners in the educational system similarly, because when we change our policies and programs that put demands on the schools, we need to do our best to offset those demands and effectively support education across all levels in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Minister MacLeod, do you wish to comment?
No need to, Mr. Chair. Just thank the member for his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Next, we have Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as the Minister may have heard me say today that in my statement, one of the unintended costs of the introduction of junior kindergarten was the necessity to provide these portables. If junior kindergarten had not been introduced last fall, would the school still have needed the portables? I wonder if the Minister can answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister MacLeod.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is that the school was getting close to their capacity If not this year, I think these would have been required. These would have been required sooner, or these would have been required eventually.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's my understanding that the school was anyway fairly full, and then once there were 50 or 60 junior kindergarten students added to that, then it was untenable. One of the good things about our system of government is that we can do a supplementary appropriation of this kind and be a little more nimble in response to the school's needs rather than having to wait until the fall to the next capital plan, which then of course wouldn't come into effect until a year from now. So those are my comments, nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister MacLeod.
Just a comment.
Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just want to be clear that I do support these two items that are in the supplementary appropriation, but I'm wondering if someone, one of the witnesses, can tell us what the position is of the supplementary reserve for infrastructure. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Sturt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the 2017-18 supplementary reserve will be overexpended by about $7.5 million. That includes, though, a special warrant related to the barges that will be repayable over time. So, but for the year, it's $7.5 million over the reserve amount. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sturt. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, given that the supplementary reserve then is in a deficit position, how does that show up as debt in the in our accounts? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Sturt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as the member would be aware, the estimates are that they're estimates, and as the year goes along, the supplementary reserves are accessed for situations like this. Departments also end up at the end of the year with some lapsed funding, and as that all gets figured out at the end of the year, then we'll be able to figure out our cash position and know whether that's going to add to our short-term debt or whether we'll have adequate resources for the year to cover all those expenditures. But if it is beyond what the revenues we had for the year, then that would go on short-term debt. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sturt. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the Deputy Minister for that explanation. So, does this affect our overall long-term debt or our debt wall in any way? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Sturt.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, the short-term debt as well as the long-term debt goes under our debt limit, which is 1.3 billion is the federally imposed debt limit. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sturt. Mr. Riley.
Mr. Chair, so perhaps one last question. Is the department looking at whether what is the supplementary reserve going to be for 2018-19? Is it the same level, or what sort of lessons learned are there when this goes into $7.5 million of debt? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the capital SUP will be at the same level, which I believe is $5 million. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Riley.
So, and I know that the Deputy Minister talked about this, that $10 million is related to the a special warrant for the barges for the marine transportation services. So, when does that amount start to get transferred back into the revolving fund that was set up for expenses related to the marine transportation services? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Sturt.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So my understanding is that it'll be repaid over a 15-year period for the contributions we've made to them. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. Mr. Riley.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. So over a 15-year period, I guess I was hoping for something shorter than that, but the amount that gets charged back to the revolving fund, does it include the interest on the short-term debt or any interest or related to this special warrant? Does it get charged back to the revolving fund? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Riley. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, we'll charge the short-term interest or the interest on that short-term debt back to the revolving fund. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Any further questions, committee? Seeing none. See no further general comments, we'll now proceed to a review of supplementary estimates by department. The committee has agreed to begin the review with the Department of Education, Culture and Employment operation expenditures not previously authorized, $1,500,000. I will now open the floor to general comments on the Department of Education. Seeing if there are no further comments, does committee agree to proceed to the detail contained in the table document? Agreed. Committee, we'll now begin at page 6. Page 6, which I just wrote right out. Okay, supplementary estimates, infrastructure, expenditure number 4, 2017-2018, education, culture and employment operations expenditure under not previously authorized, $1,500,000. Does committee agree? Agreed, thank you. Next we have under supplementary estimates, infrastructure expenditure number 4, 2017-2018, under the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment, capital investment expenditures not previously authorized, $900,000. Does committee agree? Agreed, thank you. That's it. Okay, total department, $900,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Okay, that's it. For this one. Thank you, committee. Do you agree that you have concluded consideration of table document 135-18 brackets 3? Agreed. Thank you, Minister, and our thanks to the witnesses for Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that consideration of table document 135-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 4 2017-2018 now be concluded, and that the table document 135-18 brackets 3 be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Motion is on the floor and is being distributed. Thank you, committee. Motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Do you have another motion? Huh? Oral motion? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to continue consideration of table. Pardon me. Would like to consider table document 136-18 (3) supplementary estimates operation expenditures number 4 2017-2018.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Okay, Okay, committee, we have agreed to consider table document 136-18 (3). Does the minister have any opening remarks?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm here to present supplementary estimates operation expenditures number 4, 2017-2018. This document provides for an increase of $29.2 million to the operations budget. Major items in the supplementary estimates include $20.7 million for demand-driven, non-discretionary items such as out-of-territory hospitals and physicians, extended health benefits and Métis health benefits, and the residential Southern Placement Program. $959,000 to provide for the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority's pension plan, and $181,000 to provide increased contribution funding to Avens, a community for seniors. $2.8 million for projected costs in the Income Assistance Program, $2 million for activities under the Early Learning and Child Care Agreement. These expenditures are fully offset by revenues from the Government of Canada. $1.7 million for compensation increases, replacement vehicles and new mandatory equipment for the RCMP-G Division, and $857,000 for increased grants and lieu payments to municipal taxation authorities under the grants and lieu property taxation policy. That concludes my opening remarks, Mr. Chair. I am prepared to respond to committee's questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. We have agreed to begin with general comments. Does the Minister of Finance wish to bring witnesses into the House?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Sergeant of Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Even though they're there, it's all process. Thank you. Would the Minister please introduce his witnesses once again? Thank you.
Switched it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To my right, I have Mr. David Sturt, Deputy Minister of Finance. To my left, I have Mr. Sandy Kugluktar, who is the Deputy Secretary to the FMB. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. I will now open the floor for general comments. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my first question relates to page number 4. Under Education and Culture, there is a new expenditure of $2,015,000. Could the Minister please tell us exactly what this money is going to be used for? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Sturt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the N.W.T recently signed a early learning and child care agreement with the federal government that provides funding over a number of years. I believe it's a 10-year agreement. and there's a variety of activities to support early childhood operators under that contribution. The first $2 million in the first year, there's some additional positions that are being added to help support the work with the various child care operators, as well as some other activities that are included in there as well. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's my understanding that there are 3 new positions, and obviously they wouldn't be worth $2 million. So what is the balance of this fund being used for? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple of the items that are included under the activities that are going on. Professional development and training to support training for licensed center, child care center-based early childhood development programs, cultural resource development and distribution to some of the centers, supporting some additional post-secondary training for early childhood workers, scholarships that are provided to support students that are enrolled in early childhood programs, some health and safety funding, and then some additional grants for equipment and those sorts of things for child care operators. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I recognize that this is not the Deputy Minister's department, but it was my understanding that this money was earmarked for the availability and affordability of childcare. How does this expenditure relate to those mandate goals? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister MacLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as a member aware, and she pointed out before, the money is for the first year of this program, so this is what the money has been expenditure for this year. There's subsequent years that are coming up, and the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment has assured me that he'd be able to provide a further detail in a briefing to social programs. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Ms. Green.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am highly unhappy that we are being asked to authorize an expenditure for which we do not have a plan, despite the fact a bilateral agreement has been signed. The Minister has been holding out on us in sharing this information, and now we know why. The information that the spending that he contemplates does not further the mandate objective and doesn't do anything about availability or affordability of childcare. So now we have this information in public. I will have questions for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment tomorrow. In the meantime, I would like to ask the Minister of Finance what precedent there is for asking members to approve a budget for which there is no plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Okay, Mr. Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to confirm there is a plan in place with this early learning funding. As I mentioned in the House today, that in order to can't share the full details until announcement has been signed with the Government of Canada. We're waiting for them to make that announcement, and be happy, more than happy, and willing to sit down with committee and go through the details of the accessibility, the high quality of programs that are going to be earmarked with this $2 million for the 2017 year. And as I mentioned in the House, I'd be more than willing to come before committee and share the details of that plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am not satisfied with that response. We have asked the minister continuously over not just weeks but months to share the details of this plan with us in confidence as the Standing Committee on Social Development. He has consistently refused to do that, and that's in spite of the fact that the regular members have received details of other federal government spending prior to an announcement. This is strictly a stalling tactic by the minister to avoid any accountability on the way that he is envisioning to spend this money. From what the Deputy Minister of Finance has just told us, this in no way addresses availability and affordability of childcare. And I am very disappointed, and there is no reason for us to be put in this position of approving money for which we have no plan. That's not a question, that's a rant. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister MacLeod.
And it was a rant well taken. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions? Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I too share the frustration of my colleague from Yellowknife Centre, because I've sat in on some of the Standing Committee on Social Development meetings where childcare has been discussed. This agreement, the minister has continually said that I can't share details with you, and then all of a sudden the first year funding pops up in a supplementary appropriation on the floor of the House. That's not, you know, we're all big people in this room. You should be able to share confidential information with us. This is not a way to do business, so I don't appreciate the way that this has come out. I do want to turn to the supplementary reserve for O&M. I'd like to know what the impact of this supplementary appropriation is going to be on the overall reserve. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So this, the items included in this appropriation will make that sub-reserve be over by about $4.8 million for the year. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So presumably this side of this reserve, now that it's in a deficit position, will be reconciled the same way as it is on the capital or infrastructure side, where we wait for year-end, look at spending, O&M spending within all the departments, and then determine whether there's a surplus or a deficit. If it's a deficit, then it's taken up as small short-term debt. Is that the way that this would get reconciled? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mrs. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's accurate. That's at the end of the year when we have both the operations and the capital spending, then we'll know where our final cash position will end up and whether we need to have that as on to the short-term debt. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. Mr. Riley.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the answer from the Deputy Minister. What is the reserve going to be for O&M for 2018-19, and how does that compare with the reserve for 2017-18? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister MacLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the sub-reserve for next year will be $30 million, but we don't anticipate our asks coming forward to be as high as they are this year, because with a lot of the health-related items in this sub, we're building them into the base, so we'll have that discussion during the main estimates and business plans for next year. But we don't anticipate, unless there's something unforeseen, we don't anticipate the amount being as high as next year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So just so I can confirm, the supplementary reserve then for 2017-18, I believe, was set at $35 million. And for 2018-19, it's being reduced to $20 million. Can I confirm that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't have the main estimates document in front of me, but I believe those values that the member quoted are correct. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yep, and I appreciate the Deputy Minister's response. That's the information I've got in front of me. But so it looks like the reserve is going to be reduced by $15 million, but this supplementary appropriation is for over $20 million for our out-of-territory patients. So it looks like we would still run a, if everything else being equal, there would still be a $5 million deficit next year. So how is the reduction in the reserve calculated to go down just by 15 million rather than say 20? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the reserve value, I think the member was correct, it's $20 million for 2018-19. The investments that we've made in the base on some of these items that the minister noted for health and social services and other areas, we believe that that reserve amount will work. And that we'll be able to stay within that amount. Obviously, there are other factors like fires and those sorts of things that we can never be too certain of, and so we will have to keep our eye on that and manage our resources carefully over 18-19 to make sure that we are able to meet the financial figures that are included in the main estimates. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm not sure I'm convinced on that, but only time will tell. There's $959,000 in here for a top-up for the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority's pension plan. And I know that there's been some discussion in the House about bringing the workers there into the public service. I don't know, does anyone at the table know the status of those discussions? And yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think this is an issue that has been looked at in the past. I know we have started another project with the Department of Health and Social Services to look at those costs again. And see what the requirement would be, and then see whether within our fiscal environment we're operating, whether it makes sense to do that or not. But we've started to do that detailed work again, just to update those figures and have that for a fully informed discussion on that topic. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So yeah, until that happens, we'll just continue to have to top up the pension fund. And this year, or sorry, for 2017-18, it's almost $1 million. Does anybody from the department know how much we've spent to top up the pension fund period over a number of years? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister MacLeod.
Mr. Chair, 2007-8, $739,000. 2008-9, $587,000. 2009-10, $406,000. 2011-12, $227,000. 2012-13, $611,000. 2013-14, $1,009,000. 15-16, $1,266,000. 2016-17, $872,000. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate those numbers, and it's all good evidence as to why these folks should be brought into the public service. Thanks. I don't have anything further.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. get his comment. Next, we have Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the discussion around the education and culture supplementary appropriation, there was a discussion around this early learning and childcare agreement that in our detail here is from 2017 to 2020. But I believe I heard a witness quote this as a 10-year deal or 10-year funding arrangement, and then we heard this program, and obviously this program's 4 years. So could we just get some clarification whether or not this is a 10-year funding arrangement or a 4-year funding arrangement? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Minister MacLeod.
Mr. Chair, the multilateral learning and child care framework with the Government of Canada is a 10-year. The framework is 10 years. The funding agreement is for 3 years.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Tester.
Thank you. So this the 10. So can the minister just quickly explain the difference between the 10-year framework and the 3-year funding plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think the 10-year agreement that was signed, the framework lays out broad goals to improve early childhood programming in Canada. I think the 3-year agreement is related to specific actions that were included in that 3-year. I think it's safe to say that there'll probably be further discussions on activities that may take place after that first 3-year periods. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart. Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Tester.
Thank you. So just to confirm that the 10-year framework does not have dollars attached to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Mr. MacLeod. Minister MacLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Members correct. Just the first 3 years are funded. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Tester.
Okay, actually maybe something further. I mean, are these positions solely contingent on on this funding? Like, is this something we're looking to maintain after 3 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Minister MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been given the indication that yes.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I might have other issues. I have more questions about this 10-year framework, but this isn't the appropriate time to do it, so I will defer those to a later day and save them for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. I'd like to thank the Minister and the witnesses for answering my questions. Nothing further, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tester. Next, we have Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for putting me back on the list. Mr. Chair, I note that on page 5, $181,000 is allocated to AVENS. I wonder if the witnesses could tell us what the specific use of this money will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is supplementary funding for their increased contribution, or to increase their contribution related to their collective agreement. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what he said about increasing funding so that they can meet their obligations under their collective agreement. They have been at or near a deficit for a number of years. Will this funding amount make any difference to that situation? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. certainly has to help. I understand the department continues to work with Avens, though, to look at their broader financial situation, and I understand the member is correct that they've been having some challenges on the financial side. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is a more general question about how organizations that have contribution agreements are accountable for their spending to the government. Could the minister just give us an idea of how that happens? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. There's a little difference between whether they're getting a grant or a contribution from government, but typically there is a requirement to report back, and depending on the type of organization that it is, the reporting could range from some outcomes of what they were able to do with the funding from the territorial government to the requirement for audited financial statements and more detail on what they did with their contributions from the government. So it really depends on the NGO. That are laid there. We have a third-party accountability framework that describes the different types of external organizations that we fund and what specifically they have to report on to the government each year. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can Mr. Stewart or another of the witnesses tell me what kind of accountability they have specifically for Avens, if in fact they know? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Minister MacLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure we don't have that detail in front of us, but we will work to get the information for the member. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Ms. Green.
Thank you for your responses. Nothing further.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Any further questions, comments? Seeing none. Seeing no further general comments, we will now proceed to a review of the supplementary estimates by department. The committee has agreed to begin the review with the Department of Education, Culture, and Employment. Operation expenditure not previously authorized. $2,015,000. Does the committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next we have income security not previously authorized. $2,807,000. Does the committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next we have not previously authorized, total department $4,822,000. Does the committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next we have supplementary estimate operation expenditure number 4, 2017-2018, Department of Health. Operation expenditure not previously authorized under administrative and support services, $959,000. Does the committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next we have ambulatory care services not previously authorized, $9,301,000. Does the committee agree? Thank you, committee. Next we have community health programs not previously authorized, $6,736,000. Does the committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next we have diagnostic and therapeutic services not previously authorized, $509,000. Does the committee agree? Thank you. Next we have supplementary health programs not previously authorized, $4,381,000. Does the committee agree? Yes, Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one question about this. The shortfall for extended health benefits and Métis health benefits appears, or this amount, this 4.3 million, appears to be 40% over the current budget. And of course, it seems like we're seeing an increased need for these benefits to be expanded to Northerners. Is the current level of funding going forward, has it been adjusted to address the shortfall in the supplementary health programs? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Minister MacLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it has been adjusted and it's part of the base funding for next year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Tester.
Does the minister have that information with him today? How much, sorry, the actual line item, how much it's been adjusted by in the main estimates? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Minister MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the extended health benefit, the base is $3 million, and the Métis health benefits, I think... Pardon me? It's increased by $3 million. It's increased by $3 million, and the Métis health benefits is increased by $848,000. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister MacLeod. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm satisfied with that response. I think we've seen this for a couple of years now, that the health budgets are being exceeded based on demand, and I'm pleased to see we're fixing the problem, and I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. We will, under supplementary health programs not previously authorized, $4,381,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you, committee. Next, total department not previously authorized, $21,886,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next, we have Department Industry, Tourism and Investment, Operation Expenditure, not previously authorized, Mineral and Petroleum Resources, negative $249,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Next, we have under Tourism and Parks, not previously authorized, $50,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Under Industry, Tourism, Investment, total department not previously authorized, negative $199,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Next, we have the Department of Justice, Operation Expenditure, not previously authorized, under Community Justice and Policing, $100,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next, we have Policing Services, not previously authorized, $1,691,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next, we have Total Department, not previously authorized, $1,791,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Next, we have Department of Municipal and Community Affairs, Operations Expenditure, not previously authorized, under Regional Operations, $857,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Total Department, not previously authorized, $857,000. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. There are no further comments. Does committee agree to proceed? Oh. Okay. Thank you, committee. Do you agree that you have concluded consideration of table document 136-18 brackets 3? Thank you. Mr. Bolio.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that consideration of table document 136-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates operation expenditures number 4 2017-2018 now be concluded, and that table document 36-18 brackets 3 be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Committee, we have a motion on the floor. Motion is being distributed. Okay, thank you, committee. Motion is on the floor. Motion is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. Thank you, Minister, and our thanks to the witnesses for appearing before us. Sergeant of Arms, please escort the witnesses from the chamber. What is the will of committee? Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chair leave the chair, chairman of the committee of the whole, leave the chair and report progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. We'll now rise and report progress.
May I have the report of the Committee of the Whole, member for Mackenzie Delta?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 135-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 4 2017-2018. With a motion adopted, table document 136-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates operation expenditure number 4 2017-2018 with one motion adopted. And I would like to report progress that consideration of table document 135-18 brackets 3 and table document 136-18 brackets 3 is concluded, and that the House concur with those estimates as amended, and that appropriation bills to be based thereon be introduced without delay. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Can I get a seconder? Member for Tuneta-Willowday. The motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
I thought, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 9, Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2018-19, be read for the third time. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. There's a motion on the floor. The motion is in order. Question has been called. The mover has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor, please rise.
The member for Nunavut Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Mackenzie Delta, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada-Welladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for Decho, the member for Nunakput, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South.
All those opposed, please rise.
The member for Frame Lake.
All those abstaining, please rise. The results of the recorded vote are 15 in favor, 1 opposed, 0 abstention. Motion is carried. Bill 9 has had its third reading. Mr. Clerk, will you ascertain if the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, the Honourable Margaret Tom, is ready to enter the chamber and assent to bills?
Please be seated. Mr. Speaker and members of the Legislative Assembly, good afternoon. As Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, I am pleased to assent to the following bills. Bill 1, Western Canada Lottery Act. Bill 9, Appropriation Act, bracket, Operations Expenditures, bracket, 2018-2019. During this session, the government of the Northwest Territories will be introducing the following bill for consideration by the House. Supplementary Appropriation Act, bracket, Operations Expenditures, bracket, number 1, 2018-2019. The government considers this bill essential to the good conduct of government, business, and as such, I recommend its passage. Thank you. Kwanani, merci beaucoup, masicho, Kwana.
Order.
Please be seated. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Wednesday, March 14th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, Bill 8, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 1-18.3, Minister Statement 19-18.3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk, and thank you to the clerk staff, and the members of this House for your patience with me today. This House stands adjourned until Wednesday, March 14th at 1:30 p.m.
Order. Good speaker.